Welcome to the World Cup Mood Board. I'm Jarrod Kimber. We're here with 99.94. Check out all of their podcasts. Not now. Now I want you to stay here for this. But now, right now, we're going to roll the bumper. All right. So, Muku's gone too early there. Essentially, what I'm going to try and explain this, it's going to be a different kind of World Cup mood board. And yesterday, Charlie looked at the sides and I looked at the sides and we put together what has been happening so far in this World Cup. But there's something else that I've been working on for quite a while. And actually, it was the first time I did it was when I was hired to do some work in the PSL at one stage. And the one thing I wanted to know going in was essentially what kind of sides are these? What's their strength? What's their weakness? And I really wanted it to be really obvious to me, so that when I did the work, it was sticking with me. So I did something that I suppose I'm now calling team maps, but hey, I might come up with a better one later on. The actual PSL one I did, it doesn't look very good. So I'll show you the one I've done for the IPL. So if you're going to be hanging around for any IPL coverage, probably around the auction, I'll start to get into these. But if you see the top left-hand corner here, you'll see this is what the average teams in the IPL do. And you can see I've tried to even that out very much. And these are ratings rather than actual run rates or anything else. But it's essentially based on run rates and averages. And then what I'm actually then trying to do is be able to tell you that all these teams play differently, right? So you can instantly see that RCB have a terrible bowling average in the power play. This big peak up the top. Right, and these go all the way around, and you can see different strengths and weaknesses for all these different teams. Okay, and then you can see the different shapes that they all have. They all have their own individual shapes. So I've done a similar thing here for the World Cup mood board. What I've done is I've used the data from T20 cricket so far this year. I haven't just used the IPL data. I haven't just used the World Cup data. And the reason for that is there's just not enough of it, and it's a bit varied. So I've gone back a little bit further. It's not a perfect system, as a lot of you might know from having seen my work here before. T20 international data is sometimes flawed, but I've had a look through it, and more or less I think it holds up when you look at the best players and the different ways that their teams have gone. So this is how they all shape up. And first thing I want to do is just take you through this, the team map system. So you can see at the very, there's going to be a lot of that, by the way. There's going to be a lot of me doing the wrong things. Muku's probably already like keeping a diary of all the things I've done wrong. But if you have a look at the top, you've got the batting power play run rate rating. Then you've got the batting power play average rating. That goes all the way around. So we have all of our batting comes around to here, and we finish off with the batting death average rating. And then we have the bowling come all the way from the bottom one here, all the way around. So on a very basic level, in fact, I'll just click some of these off. This is what it should look like if you're a perfectly well-balanced team. More or less, this is the average of these four teams and how they go. And so if you were very, very an ordinary bang average team, you would have this kind of shape. Obviously, none of our teams actually have a shape particularly like this. It's completely different, the way that they come about. And that's kind of where the interesting thing happens. And most of the things I'll be telling you are quite obvious, but there's a couple of things here that perhaps we haven't noticed enough in the last year. And there's also some extreme parts of this. But essentially what I'll be doing for each team is just going around the wheelhouse here and starting at the batting power play and going all the way around to the bowling at the death. All right, so we'll start with Pakistan because obviously Pakistan, New Zealand is the first game, and also I started with New Zealand yesterday, so let's change it up a little bit. So the first thing that you want to be aware of here is obviously that the yellow line is the average, but you want to be outside the yellow line on the batting side and inside the yellow line on the green side. Oh, sorry, on the left side, on the bowling side. That's obvious. You want higher numbers for batting and lower numbers for bowling. You can see that that's not necessarily what Pakistan has done here. If you start with the batting run rate, we can see that they are a little bit lower than what we would expect them to. They're a little bit lower. That's what we would expect, right? We know that they play safe in the power play and that Pakistan knock the ball around. The interesting thing is that this is just the numbers for this year. in previous years, there was a big spike for Pakistan in the batting power play average rating. They're not getting that this year, partly because of recent times anyway. Baba and Rizwan have stopped making runs, and there's been a bit of a dip there. You go to the middle, and if you look at the batting middle, whether it's average or run rate, they're actually losing a lot of wickets, and they're also not scoring a lot of runs. Again, this is not massively that surprising because we know that their middle order hasn't been that good, and because they haven't been keeping their top order players all the way through, and then that's going all the way through the death. So far in this year, Pakistan has been a disappointing batting team. However, they are a bowling team. So I wouldn't have expected their graph to be massively spiked towards batting anyway. But because that top order hasn't worked for them, you can see that there's been a follow-on all the way around that side of their game. If we come around here to the bowling power play, you can see that they are just a little bit worse than they should be in the bowling power play. Shahid Afridi has obviously Shahid Afridi is awesome. He's in my video on South Africa that I just put up. Shahid Afridi has been injured for some of that, so that certainly has played a part in it. And he's probably their best power play bowler, and so for him to not be around, that has caused the problem. But even then, the numbers aren't massively bad, but they are certainly not in the position they would want to be. If you have a look in the middle, they're almost a bang average bowling team in the middle, but it's at the death where they have been at their best. Now, this is funny for a couple of reasons, because if you go back and have a look at my Pakistan video, which is largely redundant, I suppose now, but if you go back and have a look at my Pakistan video, I say that they're a brilliant death bowling team, but that it hasn't actually completely worked for them. And by that, what we're really saying is that if you look at the Australia game, they lost that by bowling at the death. If you look at the India game, they lost that by bowling at the death. Those are the two games that almost cost them 2 World Cups. So in that way, they haven't been particularly good. But you can see that. So I'm going to stop doing that. Sorry, everyone. You can see that their numbers at the bowling death around here. The run rate is pretty good, but it's really the average. They just take a lot of wickets. They keep you off balance at the death. We get rid of Pakistan for a minute, and we move on to New Zealand. Now, I like New Zealand's one because it's a little bit more dramatic, their team map, and I'm a big fan of drama. There's a couple of things I'm going to mention here, but I'm going to just start with the fact that you're probably already seeing this is completely off the charts, their batting middle average. I think Glenn Phillips is averaging around the 60s in the middle overs this year. Devon Conway's averaging, I think, around 50, and Kane Williamson's averaging over 40. So essentially, you've got a bunch of players who are getting in and staying in for a very long time. This is not what you would expect. These are this sort of spike that you see here with New Zealand. It's the sort of spike that you would have seen with the great Indian one-day sides from 2015 to 2019, I suppose, where they would literally not lose any wickets in the middle overs. So that's quite a noticeable thing. But the other thing to notice before we look at anything else individual is, I said that you want to be really good on the right-hand side of the graph, and you want to be ahead of outside the yellow, and on the left-hand side, you want to be inside the yellow. They're the only team that actually follow that pattern. That doesn't mean that other teams aren't stronger than them, but it does mean that they don't have as many weaknesses, and every single, I was going to say quadrant, it's not a quadrant, is it? Whatever the sixth one is that I should know off the top of my head, but I've forgotten. But every single sixth of this game, they have an advantage over the teams that they are playing at the moment. So they score a little bit quicker at the top, and they don't lose a lot of wickets. They score a little bit quicker in the middle, and they don't lose any wickets. And then when they get to the death, they have another little jump up on run rate, and also they don't lose too many wickets at the death either. So then if we move on to New Zealand's bowling at this point, you see that their bowling power play run rate is incredible, and that is completely propped up by the fact that they just take so many wickets at the top, which you can see there. That also leads into the fact that they are not too bad in the middle overs when they bowl. So their spinners are getting a huge advantage by what their seamers are managing to do up top, but their spinners are actually also building on that, which I think is really, really interesting. And you can certainly see here that the bowling mid-average, I think that's more, even though I know how well the New Zealand spinners have been going. I was surprised that their numbers looked that good. And then you go on to the death. Uh, I think they're a team at the death that is probably outside of Lockie Ferguson anyway. I think Bolt and Southey are more about getting wickets at the death than keeping the economy rate down. And you can certainly see that having a look at this. But that is an incredible amount of wickets. This is a really, on paper, it's a fantastic team. And it really does come together quite well. Let's just get rid of the average here and just look at how the two teams line up. So there is no stunning advantage on paper for what Pakistan do compared to New Zealand. They're not as strong all the way through this particular game. And you would say that New Zealand look like certainly the better team from that perspective. The difference is, as I said, I don't think this includes, well, at a certain point, we don't know what Baba and Azam, Baba and Rizwan are going to do. So part of it is based on the fact that they have already played a big part in these numbers. But it does also show you why they're a little bit different, Pakistan as a team, than they would have been last year. And so that's certainly playing a part in how they're looking here. But their bowling doesn't quite look as good on paper compared to New Zealand. The one thing I would say is that these are numbers over the last year, and I think that Pakistan have made some very interesting changes of recent times that might help them. For instance, being able to use four seamers now, especially in Australia, I think gives them an advantage, that they probably haven't had at times before, or just being able to bring Mohammad Wasim in changes the team anyway. You've also got the advantage of Mohammad Harris coming into that top order, which will change the dynamic of that very slow power play run rate. If they do lose a wicket, and he can go in and exploit that part. Also in their middle, where they're not particularly making a lot of runs from their average, Shan Masood and Shadab Khan have now sort of joined forces in that middle. And Iftikhar in Australia is the greatest batter of all time, despite the fact he's never made runs anywhere else. So this is looking at the last year, and things have changed. But on paper, it certainly does look like that New Zealand is the better team and the more balanced team, certainly between the two. All right, so if we finish up there and we go on to, let's go on to India next. Oh, Pakistan don't need to be there. All right. So we can see with India, weirdly enough, and this is something that hasn't translated to this World Cup, that they're actually not a bad batting power play team when it comes to run rate. And average does make a bit more sense because of the way that they play. You can understand why they've got a bit more of a bump there. That then also leads on to the fact that even though they lose a few more wickets in the middle, they're still keeping a run rate there, and that's because set batters are coming through. You're hitting that middle a little bit better and scoring at a slightly better rate than a few of the other teams. Also, perhaps Sky, his numbers are ridiculous in the middle. He's probably a lot of that middle run rate boost. But it is interesting to see that India are losing wickets, because traditional Indian teams don't usually lose wickets in the middle overs. That's not how they play. They usually try and consolidate and get to the end. And that hasn't been the case this year. Just to go back to the batting power play for India as well, it's interesting that they are noticeably batting slower at the top in this World Cup, which I don't think is a mistake at this particular World Cup, the way it's been played so far anyway. But that going slow in the first over or two overs still allows them to score at a decent rate throughout the entire power play, and it means that their batters are set. It's just a different way of going about it. If you get to the end, I think this is the one thing that I did massively expect, is that India has a spike on the batting at the death when it terms of run rate. But the thing I didn't expect was that they haven't been losing any wickets there. That's only a concern for me if they do start to lose wickets there. Now, I know in the World Cup, we've certainly seen a few games where they haven't done it, but I wouldn't have thought that would have held up over the entire year in the way that it has in these particular numbers. So I'm a little bit surprised about that. That's a slight concern, just because there's going to be, let's say they play in both games, best case scenario, you would assume there is one game where their death is not going to go as planned, and they're going to lose more wickets, especially going up against India or Pakistan or New Zealand in the final. because if they do that, both of those teams are above average at taking wickets at the death. So it'd be really interesting to see how that goes. But you can see that India, pretty much all the way around there, are a slightly above average team when it comes to batting at all the way through. We come across to bowling, and we see their strength start straight away, right? Taking wickets in the power play. It hasn't translated as much to the run rate, as you can see there. They're slightly beneath the other three teams when it comes to run rate. But it really is noticeable that they're taking wickets at the top. And that does have an effect with the fact that they continue to take wickets in the middle. The interesting thing is that while they're taking all these wickets in the top and the middle, they're not particularly slowing teams down quite as much. So you can see that even by the middle overs, their spinners haven't been able to control the game as much as some other teams certainly might be able to, despite the fact that they're taking wickets, which I do find a little bit surprising. And then that goes on to the death, and I don't think any Indian fan would be surprised to know that they have a particularly bad death bowling rate. And when it comes to average as well, they're not taking wickets. So in no way are they really getting on top of anyone at the death here. But overall, compared to Pakistan anyway, this looks like a much better, much healthier mix of a team. And that's something we've said about Pakistan all the way through, which is they've decided to bat in a particular way, which makes their numbers look not as good. And they're very reliant on their bowlers. And perhaps this year, all things considered, their bowlers haven't quite fired. But when you look at the individual talent, you can see that they might, if they find form at the right time, Shaheen Afridi getting form the other day, Shadab Khan suddenly taking wickets everywhere. A few of those sorts of bowlers coming up, that will change their graph. Whereas India's has been a little bit more consistent from that perspective. Let's go get rid of India, pick up England here. Now, this is really, really interesting because this is where I expected to see some very strong strikes from England on the batting side. And realistically, the only one where they're massively ahead of the other teams is in batting power play run rate, which makes sense. That's the way that they play. They try and take you down early on, but they're not batting at the same level than they certainly have been for a very long time. So if you look at that batting power play run rate, it's slightly above the others, but it's no massive strike there. And part of the reason is that they have been losing wickets at the top. And you can see that with the average. So I suppose the best England teams, they were going very hard, but they weren't losing a lot of wickets. They were probably losing around the normal amount of wickets at that point. And you can certainly see from this that things have changed just a little bit and that they have started to lose more wickets and things have changed ever so slightly for them there. The other one that I find interesting is that they're also not really dominating in the middle. They're just above average. Just like a smidge above average. This is where they have dominated white ball cricket in both formats since 2015. Right? This is really where we've seen the major change for England. And you can see why when you go through to the average. They're just losing a comical amount of wickets in the middle. Part of that was probably Owen Morgan's, struggles. They haven't been, and also because they go so hard. But traditionally, they've been able to hold their own there and be able to play in that particular way. So you can see is something slightly different from that perspective. And then if you come down to the batting death run rate, again, they're actually below the average, which that's not what I expected to see when I came to this. But they really have struggled at the end. And again, they're losing a lot of wickets. So you can see all the way through, they're losing wickets. Now, they have a longer batting order than other teams. But if you continually lose wickets, it means that people have to keep starting as well. And I did look at the numbers for this year compared to some of the other years when they had, incredible records at the death. A lot of it is just that because they're losing so many wickets early on and then in the middle of this year, it means that they don't have as many top order and set players hitting that death region. So it's all great to have Chris Wokes and Chris Jordan and Sam Curran and those sorts of guys swinging away wildly. That's really helpful, but you want that at the other end, and you want in Joss Butler and Liam Livingstone and Harry Brook and Dawid Malan and those sorts of guys, and that hasn't quite happened in the same way that we have seen in other years. So, get rid of the average minute and just have a look at how these two teams line up. And you do get a very clear sense that it's... Oh, wait, I forgot England's bowlers. Sorry, everyone. Here we go. All right. So if you look at England's bowling, I don't think there's anything here that we'd be massively surprised about. Jofra Archer hasn't played for them this year, so their bowling average in the power play and their runs per over are not particularly good. That's for an England team, especially considering the Kookaburra balls have been reinforced, that is a really, really bad bowling average in the power play. And it doesn't help that probably the two bowlers that they wanted to use in the power play would be Reece Topley and Jofra Archer, and neither of them are here. And Reece Topley's been available for them at times this year. Jofra obviously hasn't. But regardless of that, that number doesn't really make sense. And if you look in the middle, their spinners are not quite as effective as they have been in the past. They're going for runs. They're not getting any wickets. So England's not getting any wickets all the way through the game until they get to the death, where they're getting all the wickets. Part of that is probably affected by Sam Curran of recent times, but I went back and they have actually been taking decent amount of wickets all the way through so far this year. But it hasn't affected the run rate that much. The overall run rate is just slightly down when you have a look here. And the reason that it's only slightly down, of course, is because they're not taking any wickets. So there's so many set batters that are hitting that end. So even if they lose a lot of wickets, they still have, the other team might have their number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8 to come out. So it's not a similar situation than we would see with some of the other teams and how they're going. But the fact that England have managed to take so many wickets at the death this year has probably helped them. But this is, I think, of the England and Pakistan on paper, and they're both better teams than I think they have been this year. But both England and Pakistan on paper are the two teams that look a little bit misshapen, whereas certainly New Zealand and India look a little bit more how you would prefer this to look. All right, we'll get rid of the average and we'll keep India and England. So from this perspective, you can certainly see that it's really India is a better bowling team throughout the first two thirds of their bowling. And then England is a better bowling team when it comes to the death. Although England's also not a massively great bowling team if you at the death compared to average. It's just that they're a lot better than India. India's outbatting them in every part of the game at the moment, and they're even scoring at a slightly higher rate this year. Remember, with England probably more than England and India, but certainly with England, there's a lot of flux when it comes to the top order and players who've been around and everything else. Who's been fit. Also, they've been trialing players and all sorts of things. So these numbers are what they are, but they certainly give us a good idea of these teams and also the holes that they have to plug and also where things have to come together a little bit. So we just have a look at, that didn't work as well as I wanted it to. Oh, there we go. But yeah, so you can, it's just something that I've been using that I'll be talking about more and more and bringing it up for you guys to have a look at. It's a really interesting thing where it gives you a very good idea of how these teams change, where their specialities are, and how all these things work. And it's a bit of a shorthand that I use to get a really good understanding of how a team's going. It works slightly better in franchise cricket just because teams generally play their best players all the way through. They play in one big block. They don't play a bunch of games here and then a bunch of games there and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's a few really interesting things to have a look at from that. I'll just come across and just have a look at if there's any questions. Take that. You don't need that anymore. What have we got here? Okay, so, let's turn down my microphone. Collab with a great cricketer. Look, they're my mates, and I've obviously been on their podcast before. I don't think that we're going to be doing anything specific. Let me move this page back over. Just realised I've got the wrong one up here. I don't think massively we've got anything planned for each other, but obviously I know them quite well. I've been on their podcast probably a couple of times. I don't think they've been on my podcast, actually. I should get Sam on one day, or Higo on one day. But yeah, there's nothing planned in the future, but possibly either of us could do something there. What else have we got? Free Speech says, game is actually decided by captain ability to see the ability of his own batters and bowlers. Nah, not really. Because everyone's got key... this is the thing, especially about T20 cricket now, is that most players are going to have their roles assigned to them before they go out there anyway. There will be slight fluctuations with the captains. I'm not saying, and I've done entire videos on this before, but I'm not saying that there is no effective captains, but generally it's massively overstated. And weirdly enough, because if you look at New Zealand, for instance, at the moment, everyone's got their assigned bowling role and nothing's even changing. These teams know very much what they're going to do in any given situation before they're on the field. It's not so much about captaincy. World Cups are also... The one thing that I would say, and this isn't just captains, this is captains, coaches, and probably the teams themselves. There is an element, and I talked about this in the podcast with Bharat, of problem solving is a big part of that. But it's no longer, we're still very stuck in this whole thing of, captains do this and everyone else follows. That's not really how the game works and how it has evolved over time. You have people who are very much involved in bowling plans. You have people who are very much involved in fielding plans. The game itself has definitely moved on a little bit from captains. But when you say that the game is actually decided by captain ability to see the ability of his batters and bowlers, well, your captaincy ability can be great, but if I'm your death bowler, you're probably going to lose. The real thing is that they know what these players are, and they've come in with it beforehand, and they certainly understand how that works. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them through. Oh, there's a couple here, sorry. Prajnesh says, do you think India can go with Yuzi and Ash as spinners? Seeing that Ashwin has been semi-decent with the bat, Akshar hasn't shined with bat or ball. Look, Akshar hasn't shined, but I like that combination. I mean, I really like Chahal. So if they bring Chahal in, I don't have any particular problems with that at all. And he spins the ball a different way to Ash, and Ash gives him that backup with the bat. But I like the combination of having Akshar and Ash together. I like the extra batting that they bring about. Akshar's obviously also a fantastic fielder. So I suppose at a certain point, it comes down to if Akshar's form is what it is and they don't think it's about to bounce back, then maybe they're not going to lose anything from bringing Chahal in. But for me, I'd probably keep Akshar in unless I was looking at bringing in another seamer, which I don't think they will. Is it? I'm just trying to remember. This is now a 3-time. It's going to be the 3rd or 4th time this pitch has been used. We all thought that they would have new pitches for the finals. No. In fact, there's something to be said here as well for this. We should definitely buy this. This is why we need hybrid pitches for big T20 tournaments. We can't be playing, and you could argue the same for one-day things. For the group games, you should be playing on hybrid pitches so that we have a nice fresh pitch available at the end for the finals. We shouldn't be playing a final on a pitch that's been used a bunch of different times. It's weird. And also, it's very rare that those used pitches produce good cricket. They usually produce kind of crappy cricket, right? It just, for me, it just seems like a huge error there. Mahal says, can you do the same wheel analysis, map analysis, I think you mean, sir. My team maps, but yeah, on the games played in this World Cup. I can, but when I looked at it, it's so random, and the shapes are just completely out there. I don't think it's worth having a look at, which is why I went back a little bit further, but then I tried to explain the bits as best I can. But yes, I'd prefer it to be more cricket having been played to really have a look at them, because it's a sort of thing that one partnership, obviously. I'm trying to remember, there was a team I was looking at. Scotland. So I did a similar thing with Scotland after 3 games. So not 4 games, but 3 games. And in one area that had a batting average of 150. It might have actually been against spin. I might have been doing a pace versus spin wheel map, which I can also include in that original one that you guys saw there. Yeah, I mean, Ireland is not an 150 average against spin team. They've just had a decent couple of games. And so you do have to be, that's why you have to look at it a little bit more than that. Vinay says, why the stances are pre-90s batters like old people using stick for support? Batters used to keep their bat down. I think that's what you mean. I think that's what you're talking about. So quite traditionally, I think England is one of the few countries where the bat was raised. And even then, not all the time. It became a bit of a fad. But traditionally, that you would have your bat on the ground as the bowler came in. And there are still people who swear that that is the better method because it helps with bat flow and bat paths. There's something to do with the way that you move it up and back is better than keeping it up and then half doing it back. And I'm not a batting coach, so I can't really help you with this. But Greg Chappell is someone who is huge on the fact that batters should keep their bat on the ground. Some players you will see midway through careers will change over a couple of times just to give them a fresh thing. When I used to have a problem with my back lift. So I used to bat that way with my bat down. The problem was that then I went all full Brian Lara with it. And it meant because I wasn't Brian Lara as a batter, it meant I was very susceptible to Yorkers. So I went to that sort of more, I suppose, Graham Gooch would have been the player that would have been mentioned at that stage. And it was done by my coaches to help. And it seems that has been I think it's harder to regulate your bat lift if it's on your feet as the bowler comes in, where it's much easier to regulate it if it's here. I think that's one of the ideas. But as I said, I'm not a batting coach, so I'm sure there's a much better reason out there. I'll just see if there's anything else here. Heretic says, what makes New Zealand so good in World Cups, considering they've been the same team in bilaterals, but are not that great in them? World Cups are generally bowling events. Well, this one even more so, but the best bowling attacks generally win you World Cups more than the best batting lineups do. It's the same in most tournament play within cricket. And if you look at what they do, they have a very, very consistent batting lineup, and they always have a very, very good bowling lineup, which means there's maybe less that can go wrong with their team than perhaps some of the other teams coming in. Also, when you say that they're not particularly good at bilaterals, you look at that record that I showed you there before, there's nothing wrong with that record. They have a very, very strong, lineup from that perspective. They might not dominate in the way that, I don't know, we've seen teams like India and Pakistan and, South Africa and Australia in one-day cricket at times, but they're very rarely poor as well. But I do think that they just play very even cricket. And the other thing I would say, I talked about this on the podcast with Bharat, which I think has just gone up on the site as well, is that I think New Zealand specifically are one of the smarter teams when it comes to problem solving. And I don't just mean, I sort of mean that going back to the 70s, really, that they seem to have a team. And, you look at some of their captains, Martin Crowe and Jeremy Coney and Stephen Fleming and Kane Williamson and Brendan McCullum. Some of them are not outstanding cricketers. A couple of them are, greats. And then, a couple of more in the middle. But even now you talk to them about cricket, and the way that they talk about cricket seems to be on a different level to everyone else. And that's not just that they've had 5 lucky captains, right? I think there's a lot of people within New Zealand cricket who have that sort of innate, I don't know what you would call it, but yeah, like a problem-solving ability to their cricket, which again plays very much. But I think being a very even-tempered team as well helps them a lot when they get to World Cups. Because World Cups are... we had Kate Cross on the podcast recently, and she was talking about, I think the England World Cup was one of her first major events of that kind of nature. And she was talking about how she really struggled with, having to be in a new city every day, the stress of the World Cup, the travel schedule, the training schedule, all these different things. It is a different kind of thing. So you do need... a lot of even-tempered sort of people. And I remember, working in for St. Lucia and talking to some of the West Indian players and also some of the coaches. And one of the things that they said was that era when West Indies were very good, they had a lot of players who were very passionate, but they were also very even keel sort of people. So if they had a win, they'd be really excited about the win. And if they had a loss, they'd be disappointed about the loss. But they'd also, whatever the result was, they'd get over it. And I think that's probably something we've seen from New Zealand a bit over the years as well. Bazant says, India without Syria have limited options in the middle overs. And how can India utilize Hardik, who has been semi-decent in the death overs? Well, I mean, I don't think they have limited options because they haven't. I mean, if you look at it, KL Rahul's made a couple of 50s. Rohit made a 50 as well. Virat's made a 50, and then obviously you have Sky. They can also throw Rishabh up. I'm assuming he's playing. I haven't checked all what the latest on that is. Into those middle overs if they want another disruptor in the middle overs as well. Yeah, I think you prefer if you had Jadeja, you probably don't mind Hardik batting further up the order. But without Jadeja, I do kind of think that there is there's maybe a slight need then for Hardik to be held back a little bit. But I think they have the flexibility with Ash and Akshar also to be able to do that if that's what they want. Yeah, I think from that perspective, it makes sense. I'm just going to have a short break, go through, see if there's any other questions. I think Muku is going to play us something from my podcast with Bharat. And I'm just going to just see if there's any other questions before we finish up for the day. And I've got a couple of other things to do, some other videos that I'm working on as well. No, Muku's not going to play that video? I feel like he is. So I'll just go through some questions. Apparently that's not going to work, that one. We've actually, considering it's just me and Muku and neither of us know what we're doing with any of this, we've actually managed to keep these things working fairly good so far. What else have you got? I could probably do that one. And Muku, are you going to play the other video? Fuck it.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
There's only two teams that have a better than 50% win-loss ratio in World T20 history who haven't won, right? And it's New Zealand and South Africa. And New Zealand have made a final, and South Africa haven't even made a final. I mean, they've made two semi-finals. And again, we got Jarrod Brevis and Chris Morris and AB de Villiers and David Miller and Faf du Plessis, Tabraiz Shamsi and Gigisa Rabada and Anrik Norgay. There's something not right here. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't. It is, if South Africa was a soccer club, you would start hearing about these really world-class players you speak about wanting to go to a club which would win titles, right? Like that's what it would be. And I think the Australia-South Africa angle comparison is a good one. I almost feel like now, having lived here for a few years and having seen the sporting culture here, I think it's also the grand final phenomena with Australia. They speak about so many grand finals so often, and it's such a big deal, whether it's the NRL or the AFL or, I mean, it's not called a grand final, but even the Melbourne Cup or whatever. It's all about winning the big prize.
Beautiful. So, yeah, that was me and Bharat talking about the South African Schmozzle, whatever you want to call it there. But let's just go on to, I've got about 3 questions left, and then we can move on. Then I can go do the rest of my shows, and you can go watch what have I got up? The South African video is quite fun. Plus the full podcast with Bharat's also there. Shabham says, why is Rishabh Pant as a player struggles with T20 eyes when he's a formidable test and ODI player? Similar case with Joe Root and Steve Smith. Well, they're all completely different. And Joe Root was a fantastic T20 international player. Played one of the best innings I've seen. It was a very good player for Yorkshire back in the day. Played Big Bash. Played some really good cricket in the Big Bash. I think part of the thing with Joe Root is the game slightly moved beyond what he was good at, which is fair. But he just stopped playing it. I don't think there's anything particular there. I think Steve Smith is slightly different. I think the thing with Steve Smith is that he doesn't really have... He finds it very hard to put a... And we see this with a lot of guys. You could probably put Virat in this and Kane Williamson in this as well. And there's probably a lot of lesser known players that are similar. Bubba maybe as well would be there. They find it very hard to adjust in their mind the premium they need to put on their wicket. So they very much are still looking at it in an old-timey way of, in a 4-day way or a 5-day way, or even a 50-over way of, I'm the guy who has to make the majority of the runs here, and I have to, so it's really important for me to do that. And they don't have the ability sometimes to do that. The other thing with Steve Smith is I think it does actually take him a long time to score quickly. And so we have seen, I remember a couple of years ago, he had a strike rate for a good couple of years of 2 runs a ball at the death. That's really good. Anything over 1.7, is decent. And once you're getting up to 2 runs a ball, you're an elite player at the death at that point. The problem was that it took him, 20, 30, 40, 50 balls sometimes to get to that level. We saw the incredible innings he played against Pakistan at Mohali. So we know that he has to get there. But the only way for him to do that, and he started realizing this as well, is by opening. The problem is, do Australia really need Steve Smith to open? I would say that, they don't. And I know they've had a lot of chats with him. They tried to make him into a number 4. He didn't want to bat at number 4. Then he forced his way back to number 3 for a while. Then Mitch Marsh made all those runs at number 3, and that moved him to number 4. Then he said he wanted to open. He's a competitive person, and he loves batting, and he doesn't want to miss out. I think he does have a bit of a FOMO when it comes to that sort of thing. But I'm not sure he naturally has the best game when it comes to T20 cricket. Rishabh Pant, I think, is completely different. Rishabh Pant was absolutely fantastic as a T20 player for a good couple of years there. And he had one bad year, and everyone tried to turn him into an anchor. And I think it has confused the way he thinks about T20 cricket. The actual international numbers, and this is something you'll hear a lot on this channel if you haven't been here before, Shabham, but I'm never too worried about that. In the same way, I don't look at Dawid Malan and go, he must be one of the world's greatest batters ever because he has great international numbers, when I've seen him play domestically, and I know he's a above average talent, but not a freak of nature in any way. Players don't play a lot of international cricket. It comes here and there. It's not the same as tournament cricket where you get a good long run on similar pitches, back to back. So I'm not too worried about that overall. My bigger problems with Rishabh Pant is that I think India had a player who could average 25 to 30 with a strike rate of 165, and India and Delhi decided that wasn't the player they wanted. They wanted a player who would average 35. And I don't necessarily understand that, because I think that player is probably easier to find than the other guy. But it's something we've talked about a lot. There's a lot of coaching in T20 cricket that's still trying to turn all these guys into anchors, and then you end up with too many anchors in your side. So the whole thing's so random from that perspective. Akshay says, would India prefer to chase or bat first, considering their over-dependence on 2 batters and a considerable underperforming bowling combination? Have they been underperforming as a bowling combination in this tournament? Is that fair to say? I'm trying to think of their games. I wouldn't have... That doesn't instantly spring out to me as a huge problem. I think if you line up India all together and you go, well, their batting at the death is fantastic and their bowling at the death is terrible, you'd probably prefer to be batting at the death at the end of any game than bowling at the death from that perspective. The over-reliance on the 2 batters is interesting because obviously they've still had 3 half-centuries from the other 2 openers. And Hardik, has Hardik put on a couple of 30s? Certainly made a 30, hasn't he? So I do think from that perspective, I'd be less worried about that. But yeah, if you're looking from a strength to strength thing, Their batting at the death seems to have been more of a strength in that way than anything else they've played. So perhaps if you're in a knockout game, you'd want that to be at the end. I think they're not. I don't think any team should be worried about anything like that, though. I think any team would be looking at. I think any team would be looking at the situation at the moment and just being, okay, what suits us for the next game, based on matchups, based on this ground, based on how we've, but based on what our team is. I don't think you would ever go, oh, we've only got 2 guys in form with the bat, so we need to do this, or our bowlers aren't doing well, so we need to do this, because you're backing your players to play to the best, to a reasonably high standard. You're not actually going, we're only going into this game with 2 batters. No team would ever do that. And also, there's no reason for India to do that because 5 of their batters have put in performances at various times in this tournament. I just saw a really interesting question. And Kelly says, who do you think deserves to win this World Cup? I wouldn't say. So if you'd asked me in the last World Cup at this stage, I would have said England or Pakistan deserves to win it. I think they were the 2 best teams going into the finals. And hilariously, neither of them made the final. I'm not sure that New Zealand have been really good. But have they been the outright best team in the tournament? Probably not. Pakistan lost 2 games from unlosable positions. You could argue that every single game they played in, they've been in a position to win it quite convincingly. England have been patchy and didn't get to play. Like England lost to Ireland and didn't get to play against Australia. I don't think we know what England is yet. Their death bowling has been their absolute strength, and that no one thought that coming in. And then India have been quite good against the average teams. They snuck home against Pakistan, almost snuck home against South Africa. And then obviously the Bangladesh game without the rain would be really interesting, what might have happened in that particular game. So I'm not sure that there's a team here that I would say as automatically deserves to win. I mean, deserves to win doesn't make sense either, but I suppose the best way of saying, I'm not sure there's an automatic best team. And that follows into this question, which I hope I've got right. Vishal says, has this been the most competitive World Cup of all time? There's no way I can answer that without just oodles and oodles of recency bias, because you can only remember, it's hard to even look beyond any other World Cup. And T20 World Cups, I suppose, are more even by design because teams lose a little bit more. And the best teams don't always rise to the top. So, and it's a short tournament, compared to some of the one-day tournaments, we have a lot more games in the World Cup, one-day World Cup than we do in the T20 World Cup at the moment anyway. So that's a really hard one. It does feel incredibly competitive. We've had so many... we've had quite a few upsets, but more importantly, we've had a lot of underdog victories as well. So not all of those are massive upsets, and in some cases, they make a little bit more sense than in years gone by, like, Ireland beating England, especially, considering the conditions in that particular game. It's a upset because, it's a underdog winning because they certainly weren't the favorite. But it's maybe not a massive upset in the way that some of the other games have played out. So I don't know it's the most competitive of all time. It feels to me, it's even going back. So the worst team in this tournament is probably the UAE. And the UAE almost beat the Netherlands. And the UAE beat Namibia, who beat Sri Lanka. And the UAE played some decent cricket. They're still building their team, and the 2 batters that they're sort of banking on didn't quite fire the way that they would have hoped they would have fired. The young bowler was good, and their seamers really played some good cricket. If you look at it from that perspective, I don't think we've ever had a World Cup where the worst team was as good as the UAE. So on a quality of unevenness of what you're talking about, and competitiveness, I don't think we've ever had a World Cup where we've had this many underdogs win and also this many massive upsets and also the worst team was still a team who had the ability to beat another, almost beat one team and beat another team who would go on to beat major teams. I said beat a lot there, sorry everyone. So I think from that perspective, I can't think of another World Cup where that has been the case. I suppose 92 World Cup, it would be quite interesting. I can't remember Sri Lanka's full form in that tournament, but Zimbabwe beat, I think Zimbabwe had a pretty ordinary tournament, all things considered, but beat England. So 92 World Cup. And when you look back on it and you think that there weren't that many teams in that World Cup, and Zimbabwe would go on in the 90s to be quite good, and by the next World Cups, Sri Lanka would win. That was quite strong. Kenya beat, and by 96, we've got a lot of teams who are coming in for the first time who aren't particularly good, but Kenya beat the West Indies in that one. But I think there was, teams like the UAE in 96 would just, this UAE team would absolutely smash the UAE team in the face from the 96 World Cup. So I think all those things considered, I find it hard to say. I think it's been the most interesting, probably the most competitive, perhaps the most even, one of the most interesting as well. It's really been a fascinating tournament all the way through. And in some ways, it's kind of what you want a World T20 to be. A little bit random, helping out newer nations coming through. So many upsets that you can't, I was saying on the podcast of Bharat that, there was the 3-game day, and because it was going to be played all overnight, I knew I wasn't going to be able to cover all 3 of those games. And so I had to make a choice. And I picked the South Africa-Netherlands game to be the one that I would get up for. And that would be an automatic pass in most other years, right? You wouldn't even think about that. And I wasn't thinking, South Africa are going to choke. I was just thinking, it's an interesting matchup for the Netherlands. And I thought that if they batted first and they made, anything over 125, their bowlers could make that game a little bit more interesting. Well, they didn't make it interesting, actually. They won it easily in the end. And I don't think in previous World Cups I would have even particularly worried about those sorts of. Do you know what? I wouldn't have had the inkling that something would have happened. But I'd seen enough of Netherlands, and it's the same with Zimbabwe beating Pakistan, all those sorts of things. I do think, I think all things considered, it's just a fantastic tournament, and I really enjoyed covering it. I've probably covered it in a different way than maybe a little bit similar to what we did with the last World Cup, but I've covered it in a different way. Traditionally I would be at the World Cups. I was supposed to be at this one, but I decided not to go. Traditionally I would be out there at the World Cup covering it and living it. It feels very different just watching it every game on TV. And it feels like I've seen more cricket than, someone like Bharat, who you can't see all the games because you're flying between games and you're doing a press conference while another team's playing and all those sorts of things. And so I feel like I've seen so much of this tournament, and perhaps I haven't always seen as much as some of the other tournaments, but I do think this has been absolutely fantastic. And I've enjoyed it in a way that I don't always enjoy World Cups. I love World Cups. I think for me, as an international cricket writer, someone who covers kind of all the teams, World Cups are like my jam. And this has been, even more my jam. Very jammy. All right, well, I'm going to leave it here. We will be back tomorrow with a game. 2 days of non-games, and then we're back. It's incredible, when it came to Monday, and I was suddenly thinking to myself, oh my God, that's it. We've only got 3 more games. We had 3 games in a day coming into that. So I'll be back. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll do something, hour and a half, 2 hours after the game, whenever we can get our shit together. But if you haven't seen the South African video that we put up, it's about the history of South Africa cricket at World Cups. There's probably a lot of stuff in it that you don't know. There's certainly some stuff that you will not know, but a lot of it is just going through the various problems that they've had in all the different tournaments so far. But to play you out today, Muku's just going to give you a touch of that, and I will see you tomorrow. Smashing the ball everywhere against Zimbabwe. He was clearly on a mission. South Africa weren't really fighting their fellow African nation. They had already destroyed them. They were just trying to beat the Hobart weather. And in truth, you could see that they were always losing that battle. This game probably shouldn't have gone ahead. No World Cup match should be played in conditions this wet. The South African bowlers could barely grip the ball in the second part of their effort. It had continued to rain, and quite heavily at this point, and the Zimbabweans could barely stand up on parts of the field. QDK, for everything that he could do, hit the ball as hard as he could, hoping he could beat the rain. No one actually knew what any of this meant at that point. South Africa still had a lot of games to go. Yes, if Pakistan had a brilliant tournament from then on in, it could cause problems for South Africa. But as Pakistan lost to Zimbabwe themselves, this game was kind of discarded. And now it looks like another match that cost them a crack at the World Cup. The umpires did try and push this result far beyond where they ever should have. The ICC clearly wanted a result as much as South Africa did. And eventually it took Zimbabwean captain Sean Williams turning to the umpire and saying, "This is a World Cup." That was enough to eventually make the umpires realize that this was just not fit conditions. It was not a game that should ever have gone ahead. You could almost argue it maybe never should have started.